Hi, I'm Steve Kuhn with Kuhn Restoration. I'm happy to sponsor this afternoon's session, Building the Right Board with Mark Smiley. Mark Smiley is principal at Solid Ground Consulting and is a native of Oregon whose efforts to migrate elsewhere can't overcome his homing instinct. Mark's head is full of music that spans an eclectic mix, and he can find the perfect lyric from an obscure rock song if the circumstances warrant it. Sadly, it seldom does. Family is important, and raising two boys with his wife, Amy, may be his most important role. Since the boys are just teenagers, the jury is still out. College includes a degree from the University of Oregon, which education that spans the spectrum of the communications arts from journalism to classical rhetoric. Please welcome Mark Smiley.
Thanks, Steve. Nice to be there. I expect there are thousands and thousands. Actually, it looks like there's 43 people that have joined us so far, and I'm sure more will join us along the way. I appreciate that introduction. I'm going to give a little slideshow that's going to talk us through how organizations build the most effective board. And so that's exactly the focus for this discussion. There's a chat that we encourage you to post your questions and comments along the way. And as much as we can, I hope this is going to respond and reply to the needs and priorities that you have. I have some ideas on how to make that work, but again, we're going to want to hear from you and what you think is most helpful. So there will be time for questions at the end, but along the way, if you want to post some questions in chat or sort of nudge this along, we'll do that. And Francis is going to help me along the way. I'm going to go ahead and start this show up. Is that good, Francis? All right, so we're going to talk about building the board, and I really believe that the board of directors can be a valuable and significant part of an effective preservation and downtown organization. It's really important for organizations to have strong leadership on their board, and too often organizations tend to sort of shy away from building the board. They kind of feel like the board is a barrier rather than a benefit. So I really want to talk not only about how you build the board that benefits the organization, how it moves it forward, but also better reflects the community that you intend to serve and has an inclusive and equitable culture to support a really effective organization. So when we're doing our work, we work with a lot of organizations across the country. And we have an approach for thinking about organizations that we call the 4 dimensions of sustainable impact. And the idea behind this is that there really are 4 fundamental ways in which organizations can be most effective. These 4 areas are leadership, strategy, brand, and culture. And so as organizations think about strengthening their organizations, building on their capabilities, making a difference to last for the long term, to be a sustainable organization, these are the areas where investment is most important. We spend a lot of time working with organizations, and one of the things we do early and often is distinguish between what are those symptoms that groups feel and the fundamental problems that underlie those symptoms. So as an organization is trying to strengthen itself and get better, as an organization is trying to overcome the challenges that it has, it's really important to understand where the fundamentals are, and that's what these 4 dimensions are all about. So let me talk through them real quickly. Leadership is the starting point. Everything great in organizations are great because of the people who are in them. So it's really important that we give ourselves the time and the focus to build the leadership team we need. If we have a great board, everything else has the potential to be much better. If we don't have a great board, everything else is likely to be more challenging. So this is one of the first and most important places to start. When I think about leadership, I'm not talking just about the leadership team. I'm also talking about a lot of other people who are part of the overall organization, leaderships and teams overall, and we want them to be working together. So in this way, we're really thinking about all the people in the organization and not just those who are at the top or in the hierarchy as we sometimes think of it. Now in the middle of this diagram, we have 2 other dimensions, strategy and brand. And these are the ones we know pretty commonly. Strategy is how we define the difference we're going to make in the community, the impact we want to have. We try to make a difference in the community, and we try to describe that as much as we can. The brand is part of the way that we present that impact. We think of brand as your promise delivered. So strategy and brand in that way are sort of opposite sides of the same coin, but they also have very different aspects of what you do. So one person may think the question that I'm asking is about mission statement, and another may say that same question is focusing on your distinctive qualities as an organization and your key benefits as a brand. So if you're trying to find those distinctive elements, you also need to bring those out in your branding process. Now, at the bottom of this is culture. And as many smart people have said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And Peter Drucker, who started that notion, really reinforced this idea that culture is imbibed in every part of the organization. And though it's sometimes less tangible and sometimes less specific than some of the other parts of what we do, fundamentally, it's the most important. So I think of this diagram as describing first the who in leadership, then the what in strategy and brand, and then how are we going to do it? What principles and values are we going to carry forward in our culture? Now, one thing I will say about culture is that in some ways it's so important because it affects everything else. Every organization has a culture, and you either get what you get or you get what you want. But you only get what you want with your culture if you're intentional about that, if you put forethought into how you're going to build that culture and what that's going to be for your organization. So again, these 4 dimensions are the ways in which we think about building effective organizations. On a practical level, we believe that it's important to think about all 4 dimensions every time you make an investment in your organization. So if you're doing a strategic plan, which we do a lot with organizations, we commonly touch deep into the leadership, brand, and culture dimensions to make sure that brand is going to stand, the plan is going to stand, and is going to be sustainable through what the organization wants to do. There are lots of examples of strategic plans that are just sitting on shelves and become shelfware. We need strategic plans that get implemented and make a difference, and to do that, we need leadership, brand, and culture. The same is true with leadership development. We need to think about the other dimensions. When we're focusing on our brand, we need to think about the other dimensions. And always with culture, they're all together, and those are critical integration of how the organization thinks. So as a starting framework, these 4 dimensions we think are really critical as a way to think about how to build strong and effective organizations. So one thing to do is take a minute just now and think about the questions that your organization has. What are some of the questions that you face and the challenges you have? And where would you put that question? In which one of these dimensions might you place it? Is it an overlap between strategy and leadership? Is it right in the center and affecting every single one of them, like a core value might, or equity? So I encourage you to use this as a way to understand and sort of start pulling apart the challenges and the issues your organization feels. Because to oversimplify them is to never find good solutions and ways to strengthen. So with this as a starting point, I want to now focus on the leadership dimension and really specifically on boards of directors. Now, one of the challenges in working with boards is that there's not just one kind of board of director. If you look at very small organizations and very large organizations, they both have boards. They're required to by the laws of the state in which they're incorporated. But those boards can have very different roles and responsibilities depending largely on the level of staffing and professionalism built into the organization. So this spectrum begins to describe the nature of where organizations, nonprofit and community-based organizations, are in terms of boards of directors. Each one of these is a type of board that might be appropriate for a certain circumstance. So in our experience, when you have an all-voluntary organization, the board is a program implementation board because it has the responsibility for not only generating good ideas, but making sure they get implemented as well. As you grow, as you have some limited staff within your organization, the board sort of lets go of implementation a little bit, but maintains responsibility for managing those programs. But as we hire professional staff within our organization, that's when the board lets go of the day-to-day management and implementation responsibilities and steps back into a role of leadership and oversight. And this is a really critical evolution that organizations need to make as they bring professional staffing into their organization. So if you're a professional staffed organization and your board is still focusing on implementation, you may not as a board evolve like the rest of your organization has already evolved. So you might want to think about where is the right spot for us along the spectrum. How much professional staffing do we have? And what does that suggest about the role that we want to have for the board? One thing that's really critical about these roles is it's important for everybody in the board to have the same notion of what kind of board we have. Because if some of our board members think that we're an implementation board and other board members think that we're an oversight board, we could all be doing what we think is the right thing and be in great conflict with each other. So having a common notion of what our board's roles and responsibilities are will create greater harmony in the board and better partnership with the staff. One more thing I want to say about this spectrum, and this is pretty important. When you get to the far right of this spectrum, boards can sometimes stop taking responsibility for their real job. Boards have a governance job, and regardless of size, they must keep that function. When boards become only fundraising boards, and they do nothing else but raise money, sometimes we say they're give, get, or get off boards. Or when a board is just an honorary board with names but no participation, and that board has no guidance or leadership in the work of the organization. These are dangerous areas where your board is not fulfilling its full responsibility and may have delegated too much responsibility to staff. So again, to the degree that we can find the place that is the right spot for us and avoid some of those challenges of over-delegation, that's the starting point for how we build the board. Know what kind of board we want. Now we can build the board to support it. So now let's talk about the process that we go through for actually building a board. So too often, organizations have a nominating committee, and they do nominating, and that's what the entirety of board development is. My belief is that board development is significantly more than just a nominating process, and in fact, has 5 major pieces to it. These 5 pieces, ROTER, are the elements of the board development process. So I want to talk our way through each of these 5 elements, and I encourage you to think of these as a more comprehensive way of building your board and a more comprehensive and extensive way of creating the team that you need to guide your board of directors. So let me talk this through. Let's go through the letters one at a time. First, we go with recruit. We want to identify the people who we think would be the very best board members and encourage them to join the board. We want to be intentional about who we want. We want to be thoughtful about that process. We'd like to build those relationships over time so they're not suddenly thrust into roles they don't understand. We want to be clear about the expectations of what we're recruiting people into. So there's lots of things that we need to do to make that recruiting process successful. But fundamentally, we have to recruit people to join our board or we're not going to have the board members we need. And I want to encourage you to think of not just the board of directors, but other committee members and others who are supporting the work of the board, which we'll talk about as we go. Now, the first step is recruit. After we've brought people into the organization, there's 2 big investments we need to make. We need to first orient them so we can help them get ready to do the work of the board of directors, get them up to speed, help them be clear about which kind of board we are, for example, and what the expectations of this board are, as specifically and clearly as we can. And then training is continuing that education process with your board members over time. So you're investing in their knowledge and commitment along the way. One of the things we find is that board members have much higher levels of satisfaction and therefore greater levels of participation if you give them training along the way. So training is a benefit both to the organization because it gets a better functioning board, but it's also a benefit to the individuals who can use that knowledge in other organizations, in their professional life, or just personally to support what they're trying to accomplish. So again, this training can be a really valuable give back we can give to the board members who are giving us their time. Now we've got 3 of those items. Now we talk about evaluation, which is asking the question, how are you doing and how are we doing? And the significance of the evaluation process that I want to highlight is that this is a 2-way process. It's not just asking board members, are you doing a good job? Because we do need to have that conversation. But I believe the first question should be, are we doing a good job of helping you be effective as a board member? And if we aren't, what can we do to make changes there? What are the things we can do to make you a better board member? Can we provide better orientation and training? Are we clear about roles and expectations? Are our committees functioning the way they need to? Does the board staff partnership work the way it needs? Those are things that board members can come to expect from the organization. And if they're not getting it, they should let us know that. That's half of the evaluation. How is it working for you? Then the second half is, how is it working for your contributions to the organization? Are you able to give what you expect? Is there a way that we can help you be a more active and contributing member of the board? Now, this doesn't have to be very formalized. It can be very informal, but having these conversations can be really important. Francis, did you have a, no?
Yes, we had a quick question come in. Who should do the orientation for new board members?
That's a really good question. And we're going to talk about the role of the Board Development Committee overall in a minute, which has responsibility for all 5 of these functions. But let me just say to this question, it's really a partnership here where I think board and staff can work together to do that orientation, because sometimes the staff have a much deeper understanding of the programs and the details and the budgets. So we want to give them that level of detail. But I think it's also very important that board members are leading that orientation, a peer-to-peer orientation. So board members are learning from those peer board members what they're expected to do and what it means to be a board member. So there's a lot that can go into that. One thing I'd also say about orientation that can make it really interesting is that we sometimes think about putting a mentor or somebody who's sort of a buddy or a partner to a new board member. So someone who's been on the board for several years can then partner up with a new board member and help them sort of work through the questions and understand some of the vagaries of the work so that they can feel more comfortable. So having somebody look out for you can be really good. So we've got recruit, orient, train, evaluate. And as I said, this evaluation should be as informal as possible. And it's really important for it to really feel like it's a give and take there. One organization I worked with didn't want to do this in writing, felt that was just a little too formal. So their board president essentially at the beginning of every year would just take everybody out for a cup of coffee, all of the 11 board members, and just one at a time talk to them and say, how's it going for you? Are you getting what you need? Are you giving what you need? And then give them a little bit of feedback. And it was a very personal and very positive way to sort of enhance those board members' contributions. Now today we're going to have to find ways to have those cup of coffees virtually, but it still is a good idea for our board chair to be checking in on a regular basis. Like all good evaluation, it shouldn't be done just once. It's something that can be done on an ongoing basis. Now, the last of our 5 parts of the board development process is recognition. And this is the part that too often is forgotten by organizations. You know, we do really good work and people really have put a lot of time and energy into it, and we don't take the time to really thank them for it. I used to have a file in my file cabinet. It had letters of things. It was my bad day file, I called it. I'd get thank you letters and things. And I remember I had a letter in there that I would look at every once in a while when things were going sour. But it was a letter that I got from a fellow board member. And it was on a big project that I'd worked on with her. And it was a very difficult project. It was a challenge for the organization. It could have killed the organization. We had to go through about 6 months of pretty detailed work. And at the end of that, we had a very positive resolution. We were lucky. We had a lot of things going for us. But what was significant for me is about a week later, my partner, my board member, wrote me a note that really thanked me in depth about how much she appreciated my contribution to that project. And I'll never forget that letter. And I still think about that letter. I still whelm up a little bit when I think about it. Those kinds of thank yous that are done personally and regularly have a powerful way of really making people feel good about their work. And it makes people want to do more and do it again. So especially in the evaluation and recognition, these are important to build the strength and support of the board, but also help people feel good about the job they're doing. So when we think about board development, we want to think about all 5 elements here. ROTER. We recruit the people we need. We're going to go into some in-depth talk about what that looks like. Then we have to do orientation and training to make sure that we have information in the hands of our board members so that they're really effective in their job. And we keep them effective in their job and we keep them interested in our work. One of the funnest things we can do is actually give our board members in-depth training on some of the stuff that we're accomplishing, because that's some of the really juicy, fun stuff that board members like. And then along the way, let's throw in a forget to evaluate and recognize board members and give them the feedback they need to feel good about their contribution. So with this process in mind, let's talk about how you think about the board of directors. I want to give you a picture of building a board using these circles. This diagram is one of my favorite ways of thinking about the board of directors because it thinks about it as a much more complex organism than just a group of 10 or 15 people. It should be much more than that. The board of directors is the sort of centerpiece, the hub, the nucleus, you could say, of this more complex set of relationships. And for our organization to be successful, we need to develop every single one of these circles, all of the relationships throughout this organization. So let me talk through the circles that are demonstrated here on this diagram. At the center is the board. The board's at the center because they have the greatest level of legal responsibility, hopefully the greatest level of commitment to the organization. The board can hire staff, and if they do, they're embodied in the center circle as well. And then outside of that circle, we hope, is the committee circle. And this committee circle is made up of the board members and non-board committee members that help support all the committees of the board. So the fact that that circle is bigger than the board circle means we're recruiting people who can complement the board and expand that group of people, building its capacity. Now the circle out from that is the advisors and trustees circle. This is a really valuable piece in terms of helping bring in people who have limited time but still vitally care about what the organization is about. These three circles, board, committees, and advisors, trustees, we're going to come back to that in a minute because to me that's the centerpiece of governance. Now outside of that, you've got your members circle or your supporters or however you want to describe them. These are the people who care about you enough to demonstrate it, to invest in your organization, to buy a membership or pay some dues or contribute at an auction or somehow step forward with a tangible commitment of resources and support for the organization. That's what that members circle is. It's more than just, hey, you're a great organization. It's not just an endorsement circle. It's people that have actually contributed. And then outside of that is the circle of people who know about your group, who've heard about you, understand it. More than just name recognition, they understand what your mission is about. And then outside of that circle is the rest of the world. And the sad but true reality is that there are a lot more people outside of those circles than there are inside of them. So with these circles in mind, this complex layer of the organization, I want to talk about how you could build the board a step at a time. So let me just take us through this process one step at a time. So what if the first thing we did is had an active process of getting people who don't know us to know us? We call this friend raising and communications and marketing and getting our word out there. And then if we build the friends we need, then we do the fundraising and transfer those people who know us into people who support us. Now, it's a really important fundraising principle that we need people to know us before we ask for their support. So trying to move people from I don't know you to I give you money is a long stretch. That's why we take two steps: get to know them, then get to support them. That's the step process we want to take. And then once we've done that, we've got members who are supporting us financially and with their time. We might ask those people to become an advisor or a trustee. And this is the point where things get really interesting, is when we start focusing on these center circles. So let's just focus in a little bit deeper on that. Now that we're moving people in, we now move people into the trustees and advisors circle, one step at a time. Let me talk about this advisors circle. This is a really important one. There's a whole group of people out there who really care about what your organization is about. They're willing to give their time, they're willing to give their resources, they're willing to open doors on your behalf. They're willing to give you money, but more than money, they're willing to do something more than that. They're the donors that come up to you and say, is there anything else I can do? These are the people who don't necessarily want to serve on your board, or maybe aren't appropriate to serve on your board, or are not yet ready to serve on your board, but they want to do something. What's significant about this circle is it's not people in name only. There are many, many, many heritage organizations that have an advisory council, And that advisory council doesn't do very much. It really is name only and rarely even has any communication to the leadership of the group. I don't want to create that. I want to create ad hoc relationships where individuals can say, I'll give you my time and here's 3 or 4 things I can do to help. And I want to create a whole constellation of individuals who are willing to give me their time and their energy and their Rolodex, if there's still such a thing in this world, to open doors and make things possible. And if they're willing to help me raise money, I'd call them a trustee, because then they become an even more valuable contributor to our success. So first we bring people into this very ad hoc volunteer role. Once we've done that, we move people who are still even more interested into the role of non-board committee members, getting them specifically focusing on leadership development and planning and finance. Because if we develop their capabilities there, now we've got the folks to recruit for the board of directors. And that's the point of this whole diagram, is the recruiting for the board is successful when we build those outer circles and move people in through all of those diagrams. So now what we're going to try to do is create an organization where all of these dimensions, all of these circles are deep and have lots of talent and breadth in them. So this is a pretty critical approach that I have. I want to stop and see if there's some questions I can answer or some illustrations that I can bring, because then I want to talk about how important it is to think about the relationships that can start contributing to this framework. What do you got for me, Francis?
So we have one question. Every year for the past 5 years, we have recruit new board members, just 1 or 2 a year, provided an orientation with the administrator and president, provided bylaws, other documents. Then they invite the new board member to his or her first meeting, and then they quit shortly after, usually saying that they had no idea the organization did so much and they didn't have time, and or that they decided that a 3-year term was too long. There's no conflict at the meeting or anything. They certainly don't want people on the board who don't want to be there, but it's a significant expenditure of energy and attention to have someone quit in the first month.
Yeah. So here's what I think I hear in that question, and that is unclear expectations of leadership. And therefore, when people come in and find out what is expected, it's too much. Pins their ears back and they're no longer interested. And in fact, I think this is a really critical notion. I'm glad this question came up. Thank you. My belief really strongly is that we need to have recruiting materials that go out to anybody who might be interested in being on the board before they're asked to be on the board, to say, here's our job description. And you know what? It's pretty specific and it asks quite a bit. And we hope that you'll look at this because it's important. And if being on the board is asking too much, then maybe one of these other circles might be another opportunity. So that's the other thing I'd say. Number one, let's be clear about the expectations so we don't waste time recruiting people to a board only to have them feel uncomfortable and step back. The other thing that I would say is it may have been more helpful if we would have recruited those people to an advisor or committee circle first, so they had a notion of how much the organization did, what those responsibilities were. This whole set of concentric circles works with this outdated notion, perhaps, that it's really good to date before you get married, that you build relationships slowly over time, and as trust and strength of relationship increases, people will do more, commit more, and be more ready. Because the other part of that question, Francis, is that those board members who come in without a clear sense of expectations, if they don't quit, they may still hide in plain sight. And though they may be on the board, they still may not be very active because it's just too much for them to take on. So in all cases, we want to be clear about those expectations and build those expectations over time. So let me talk about one facet of building an organization that I think is especially critical, especially in these days. And that is, how do we build the board and the leadership within our organization that reflects the communities that we serve? Too often, the leadership and the board of directors from community-based and nonprofit organizations represents a little bit of the elite leadership of the community and fails to connect to some other parts of the community that care and need to know and want to participate in what we're doing, but otherwise don't have access or opportunity to participate. Now, for many organizations, there's a lot of interest in having more diverse participation on their board of directors. They'd love to have connections and deep relationships with lots of communities throughout their city or their town, but they haven't done that to bring that into the board, and they don't know how to do it. And part of the reason is there's a tendency to do, much like that question said, recruit people to come onto the board without any opportunity to build the relationship first, without an opportunity to learn and identify what is it that those communities and those stakeholders in the community might be particularly interested, so we can be serving their needs and not just expect the community to serve our needs. So this is a really important notion to me. This idea that our organization is in service to the community. One of the principles, or the fundamental principles that I believe about nonprofit and community-based organizations is that our fundamental job is to become the community organization that our community needs us to be, whatever that is. So we have to listen to the community, understand their needs, and build relationships with them in order for that to happen. Now, we can spend hours, and I have, talking about strategic planning and why strategic planning that starts with honest, deep engagement with the full breadth of the community not only builds a better plan, but also strengthens the relationships in the community. There's lots about strategic planning that's important. But in the leadership dimension that we're talking about today, it's also really important for us to think about how important it is to build relationships carefully and slowly over time. So if you look at these dimensions that you have here, one of the things about them that are really important is that we're bringing people from the outside in a step at a time. And we're not expecting people who don't know us to all of a sudden get married to us and know how to be a board member. So let me take you through a way of thinking about connecting our board to the various stakeholders in the community that we're trying to serve. So I think if you think about diversity, often what we're talking about is a number of different community interests and community experiences and community members that we'd like to have within our organization. And sometimes they are defined by general groups, and sometimes it's just individuals who bring a lot of really important experience and knowledge to the table. But if we think about stakeholders broadly, let's just describe how we might use this model to support growing the board. So we might, and often do, recruit business owners to be supporters and advisors and on our committees and on our board. And we might recruit developers and others in the industry who might also see the value of what we do as a heritage and preservation organization or as a downtown organization and say, you know, this is an organization that's relevant to me. But too often we may limit ourselves to those who have very specific personal and financial interests at this kind of level. And then our board becomes somewhat imbalanced. If we're trying to reach further, we need to think about the constituencies more broadly. Who are the residents in the community who also have a stake in what we're doing and why we're doing it? And how do we build their involvement, first as supporters of what we do, and then incrementally through our advisors, through our committees, and through our board membership. And we're trying to bring those people in, and we're doing it incrementally and intentionally. Likewise, we're trying to think about maybe those who are students in professional architecture or in historic preservation or in economic development, or who otherwise have a deep personal and professional interest in our work. And there are many folks out there who have alignment on their professional side with the work we're doing as an organization. How do we build their participation in what we do? So again, you could identify within your organizations who are all of the really significant stakeholders that we currently have active, and then who are the ones that aren't active? Who are the ones that we wish we had participating, and how do we bring them into the dimensions of our organization? So now we have a process of bringing them in. Our process requires that we think differently about all of those different community interests and those community groups out there that might be supporting our work. When we think about underserved parts of the community, those are the gaps between these wedges that we bring in there. And we need to find a way to build those gaps in there as well, so that our board, if you look at the center of this diagram, has representation in all of those groups that we're trying to get involved with. So here's a really interesting thing. It's often said that board members need to be ambassadors on behalf of the organization. And in particular, they need to be ambassadors to the community and to certain parts of the community. And board members will sometimes say, well, I don't know. I can't go out and talk to people I don't know. And what we're trying to say is we don't ask board members to go out there and talk to people they don't know. We're asking board members who have deep connections to some community stakeholder group, whether you're a business owner or whether you're a downtown low-income renter or whether you're somebody else who has an interest in what's going on. We want to make sure that you are on the board and you have relationships to a group of people who share your interests and priorities. Now, once we're together as a board, we come from many places, but we need to act as one. And functioning as one common board is what planning helps us do. But first, we have to assemble the organization, and we need to bring the relationships forward to make that happen. So this is the thing that I want to really emphasize, is that if we're trying to parachute people into the center of our diagram because we think they bring diversity to our organization, essentially what we're doing is creating tokens because we don't necessarily care about the relationships and the connections and the strengths they bring with them. We just care about some aspect of who they may represent. So I would like us to have a more comprehensive thought about building a diverse and inclusive board of directors by extending who we think our stakeholders should be. So to me, this is a really critical concept in building equity within the organization. So I'm going to ask you to do a thought experiment. There are now 67 people or so on this webinar. I'm going to ask you all to get in small groups of one. This should be pretty easy. It shouldn't take you much time. Small groups of one, and by yourself, I want you to think about your board of directors, some board that you're on or some board that you work with. I'd like you to ask the question, which of the stakeholder groups within our community do we currently have representation from? And who are the stakeholder groups within our community that we would like to have representation from, but don't? That's my first question. It's a little bit of a gap analysis. So that's the first question to ask. The second question I would ask is, how could we begin to build the relationships with those interest groups, with those community groups or those communities of interest? How could we start moving them in through the circles of involvement? Often this is done by having one or two leaders within a community sort of lead the way, sort of this tip of the spear, as is demonstrated by these diagrams, as a way to sort of open the door to that community. Who are those door openers that your organization may already know? How have you tried to cultivate those relationships by moving them into advisory roles or putting them on committees and asking them to do little things in partnership and also doing things on their behalf in partnership as a way of establishing that relationship before you ask them to take on a significant leadership? So, how are we doing in terms of our makeup, and who are some of the people that we might be able to think about bringing in? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. I'm going to take a drink of water. Your audio is not broken. Just keep working in groups of one for just another minute. So as you're thinking about this, as you're sort of analyzing this, to the degree that you're willing to share both how well does your organization reflect the different constituencies that you'd like to serve, maybe you could talk a little about that in the chat box. Where have you done well and where are the places where you're still missing those relationships? And then when it comes to those people who could be door openers and relationship builders, Those are names that you're going to want to take back to your board development committee because they could be among the most important. And I encourage you to drop some of those ideas in there. Richard, thank you for putting in their safety courses in schools. Again, these are some of the things that we can be thinking about in terms of the interests and the relationships that we'd be wanting to bring forward. Now, as you're thinking about that, I'm going to move this conversation a little bit forward. Talked about this very significant principle of how leadership fits within the 4 dimensions of strategy, brand, and culture. I've talked about really the notion of how the different layers of an organization come together to create the board of directors. I want to focus a little bit more on the how, because the promise of this workshop was how to build a board. So if you have the right initial thinking about this, and I can't say this strongly enough, understanding the kind of board you are and expectations for the board and what that looks like, you really have to do that foundational work before the recruiting is ever going to be successful. But now we're going to start talking a little bit more about the recruiting and orientation process. The first of those 5 parts of the board development process, ROTER, we're going to go through that first part. When I think about who does this, Francis asked that question before, I think that it's the job of the board development committee to be the leader of board development. Now, too often what happens is that this falls back to a staff member, executive director, who feels like because she knows a lot of people and the work that she's doing, it's her job to recruit, or because nobody else is doing it. So a strong recommendation I have is that the board development committee should be a self-directed, board-directed committee, not staff-directed, that takes responsibility for guiding the board development process. And this sort of breaks down the relationship between what the committee does and what the board does. And this is a pretty classic breakdown. So the committee develops the criteria and does the work of presiding options and potential board members for the boards to consider. But it still is the board's job to approve the criteria of what they want that board to look like so that the committee is fulfilling the board expectations that they have. It's important for the board to actually do the job of electing and terminating board members. That's not the committee's job. It's important for the board to set the stage for this committee to ensure that it's doing all of its job. In many cases, the board's job is to ensure committees do their job. And if those committees work, the board then becomes a really effective coordinator of really effective committees. And this is an example of them. Let me say one more thing about the board development committee, because I think this is a really significant priority for me. I believe that the board development committee, or sometimes we just call it the nominating committee, much to our peril, I think this committee is often the weakest committee on the board. It doesn't get much attention. It rarely meets. Usually it's for a couple of times just before elections and then in a panic. I think the board development committee should be the most important committee of the board, because think of it this way. If the board development committee is wildly successful, if it is able to do its job with great success, every other aspect of the board is going to be more successful. Every other committee is going to have the people it needs. Every other board position is going to be filled. All 3 of those dimensions, board, non-board committee members, and advisors and trustees, all 3 of those circles, which are the focus of the board development committee, are robust and full of people who care. So again, to the degree possible, we want a committee that really is focusing on all 5 pieces of board development and following through all the way here. So you'll see in this list of elements, recruiting, orienting, training, evaluating, and recognizing board members. So this is the breakdown of responsibility. One of the ways in which we help committees do their job is that we set that up more specifically with a job description. So here's the kind of job description. Sometimes we call them a committee charter. Now, this is actually more important than I might otherwise have thought. My experience is that when committees have done a very good job of creating a job description or a charter and defining their purpose and who's on it, they're much clearer about what they do. And they're clear about what they do versus what the staff does. And here's the thing, and this is perhaps the most important thing, is that those job descriptions need to create a work plan for the job, for the committee. This is what the committee is going to accomplish. And it needs to identify who is going to do those tasks. As you see here on the right side of the screen, every one of those second quarter tasks has somebody who has responsibility for doing them. So this is a way in which we can create a work plan for the committee that's relatively straightforward. These are just 2 of 4 quarters, so it takes just about a page for the whole work plan for a whole year. It helps everybody on the board know the timeline and framework for what the committee is doing. If you can imagine every board having a committee work plan like this, every committee of the board, and everybody knows that, how easy it is to coordinate what's happening between committees and knowing if they're making progress. And this is what we're suggesting. So not only do we want to have effective committees that have things like work plans, but here's an example of a work plan that the board development committee has to help support the work of the entire board development process. So this is sort of a little bit of a thing within a thing, as they say. So I really want to encourage your organization to put some attention in the board development committee and what it does. So I'm going to give you a moment to pause again. This is another one of those moments to soak it in and think about who is doing the recruiting for your organization now. Is there a committee that does it? Is that committee clear about its job? Does it have a work plan? Does it have a chair who is good and brings the committee together? If you don't have a committee, is this something that's done sort of ad hoc by the executive committee or by the executive director? Are there ways that we could change that so it doesn't become a last minute thing, but becomes a regular thing? And is there an opportunity to think about the committee that we're talking about here more broadly in creating more effective committees throughout the board so that every one of them has a really good chair, every one of them has a clear job description, and every one of them has a work plan that defines by quarter what it's going to accomplish and when it's going to accomplish that. So to me, this is a really critical piece of what we're trying to do. Now I've got some questions and some things that are going into the chat, so I'm going to take a minute here and ask Francis to give me help. Looks like there's some good posting there. Anything you could throw at me? And I think I might have even seen a hands up.
Yes, absolutely. So Nora says, what is critical to having a board inclusive participation, a broad and inclusive participation, education, guidelines, and ethics? If you want neighbors to participate, you can't have them feel intimidated by professionals or more vocal stakeholders. Everyone must understand the basics of purpose, mission, guidelines, and operating and evaluating. Essential to credibility is a training on ethics and a clear understanding of limits of board members and staff. You have to be careful. Some developers don't just join to obtain insider info or receive a heads up on opportunity. In addition, when agencies enter into development agreements and receive fees from developers, you lose independence, and independent evaluation plus community feedback are essential.
Great. So let me throw a couple thoughts here. I think there's a bunch of good ideas in there. The first thing that I would say is that I want to strongly support what was said about valuing the kind of expertise that comes from a community that may not be seen as professional. Too often we have a narrow definition of what an expert is. And my joke about an expert is a former drip under pressure. So, really, there's a lot of community expertise that exists out there in the community. So think about that. While we do need people that are experts in land use law and business and economic development and some of those professional pieces, we also need people who are deeply rooted and knowledgeable about community traditions and history, that have a knowledge of the relationships that exist there. So the first thing I want to do is I want to value those broad sets of knowledges more completely than we often do. And too often, I think, when we put skills and knowledge ahead of relationships and priorities, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I want to put relationships as a priority ahead of skills and knowledge. So the first thing I want to do in support of that question is say, let's value the community differently, because that's the starting point. And then in support of what I just heard is this notion that we have to have really good orientation to help people get up to speed, because I may know a lot about what our community needs, but I don't know a lot about block grants and how different kinds of funding mechanisms work and how the city's incredibly challenging bureaucratic system might work in terms of preservation projects. I mean, there's lots of knowledge that people just aren't going to know. So we need to help them know what they need to know as soon as possible so they can feel comfortable on that board as soon as possible. And if we don't give them that initial orientation, then they're going to feel less comfortable with every meeting and soon they're just going to quit. So in terms of orientation, it's a really critical priority to help people become effective and engaged board members right away. But it's also a really important equity issue, giving people the knowledge so they can be powerful partners in the work of the organization. So that's part of why the orientation to me is so important. I'm going to keep going. Is there anything else, Francis?
I had a couple of little messages come in directly to me. And what would you say to board members who are currently board members who say that board training or ongoing board training sessions, that they're too busy to do those kinds of things? And not operating within this structure, if you have an executive director who knows that there's a better way, but the board is unwilling to make these kinds of changes.
So there's two things there. I want to talk about the idea of a champion. And the first question essentially was asking, say it again real quick.
What do you do with those board members who say that they're too busy?
Oh, training.
Yes, training.
Yeah. So a couple things. I think that we have to respect the time that board members contribute to our organization. It's absolutely essential. And I think the saying that I like to have is that I think board members have time to give. Board members don't have time to waste. So I don't mind asking people to give their time, but I'm going to use that time exceptionally well. If I start wasting their time, they're going to start not showing up. So let's start with that. Let's make sure that we're using board members' time really well. Second thing that I want to do is that I want to recognize that the way we run our meetings may be completely ineffective in many cases. So let's pretend that we have a 2-hour meeting for our board of directors. I'd like to suggest that anything more than a 2-hour meeting is not a good idea. The old saying that I still subscribe to is that the mind can absorb what the butt can endure. So if you're going on and on and on, then you're not going to necessarily be able to really get people absorbed and connected in what they do. So let's say it's a 2-hour board meeting. Here's the challenge that I have for your organization, and this is a really powerful challenge. Get all of your work done in 1 hour. Find a way to use things like recommendations and options from your committees and a consent agenda and really efficient discussion formats to get all of your business done in 1 hour. And then take the other hour and talk about one big thing. I don't care what it is. It can be your budget. It can be your strategic plan. It could be training on a topic that is necessary. The way you make time for training is to have the organization's board meetings incorporate that in on a regular basis. So I'm not asking board members to have a bunch of extra time. I'm asking them to show up at board meetings on time and contribute while they're there, and there will be a lot of help out. So I think we really want to find a way to do that, to really create the expectation of using our meetings more completely. Another thing that I would say is I would create an expectation for every board member that once a year we're going to do a retreat. It's going to be a full day, or now these days in the world of Zoom, it's going to be some combination of 2-hour blocks while the board goes deep on planning or training or something else. Because those annual retreats are one of the most important investments the board would ever do. It's an opportunity for the board to focus on important things that may get overrun by urgent things during the rest of the year. So those retreats are critical. And now, if I have board members that say they're too busy for training, then they're too busy to be a board member, they might be better as a committee member or as an advisor, because I think every board member needs to be contributing to that. One last thing. I know there's lots of people out there who say, well, I could have time if I needed to, but I don't need the training. I already know. If that's the case, maybe they can help provide the training. Maybe you can incorporate those board members who do know a lot as co-trainers and presenters, so they're not just sitting back passively, but they're actively sharing their experience and they're sharing their story as part of the orientation. It's a way of co-opting them so that they're actually not working against you, but actually now working for you. One of my favorite things to do. So there's lots of ways that we can do that. And I think it's really important for us to find ways to make training such a priority that people don't get to say, I'm sorry, I have no time for it. All right, I'm going to keep moving along. I'm going to show you a couple of tools that will support the work of the committee. And I think one of the most fundamental tools that we've talked about essentially is a job description. Now, this is an example of a job description, and I'm sure there are lots of examples out there. I encourage you to find the one that works for you and then make sure it's accurate and completely describes the expectations you have. So let me just point out a couple things in this job description that might be helpful. It's hard to read this. I know it's hard to read this, but if you get a copy of the handouts that were loaded into the Dropbox by Francis, you can probably look at this a little clearer. But it's also possible if you want to get a more complete example of these, you can get in touch with me. I'd be happy to send you examples. But let me talk about this for a minute. In the first half, top half of the first page, we spend some time promoting the organization, talking about why what we do is good. You know, too often we talk about the obligations without talking about all the good stuff. I mean, being on a board can be great. It can be amazing. You get to work with great people. You get to make a difference. You get to learn as you grow. You get to be part of a dynamic part of making your downtown or your community vital and inclusive. And there's so much that we can do as a board that can be fantastic. Let's sell that. Let's give people a clear sense of what is the value proposition that we're providing you as a board member. Why would you want to do it? Always start with why. Then get into the expectations. And this describes the leadership, the relationship, and the resources that we expect. You're going to see a profile grid in a minute that's going to reflect that. But we really need people that are willing to step up and be leaders. We're willing to cultivate and develop relationships, and who bring resources, and not just money. They can be other kinds of relationships and partnerships and access to other kinds of tools and funds. So I want to think of resources as broadly as the community thinks of resources. We talk about responsibilities. There are three fundamental responsibilities of a board. They're fiduciary, strategic, and generative. We can go into a lot of detail about that. We're not going to right now, but that's good information if you don't know it. There's a good book out there called Governance as Leadership that has some really deep knowledge about these responsibilities that you can work with. Excuse me. On the second page, we talk more specifically about how people get involved and what we're asking them to do. So we talk about the committees. What are the committees that we have? And you could be expected to be one of these committeemen, because every board member is on a committee, because that's where the board gets its work done. I'd encourage you to detail those responsibilities, and as it does in the bottom of the second page, it says how much time we expect. Be honest about that. This says that it's going to take 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 16 hours, between 8 and 16 hours a month. Now, if it's not going to take that much, don't say it. If it's between 5 and 10 hours a month, say that. But if it's going to take between 8 and 16 hours a month, don't tell people it only takes 4. Because that's really unfair. And this gets back to the question that was posted, Francis, that if we've got people who are leaving the board, often it's because we're not being honest about the information in this job description. Now, as is true with all of these materials, they're not going to be exactly right for your organization. They're going to need to be adapted to fit what your organization needs and what it's trying to do. And we can do that. But it starts with this commitment to communicate those expectations clearly and to be willing to hold people accountable to those expectations. Because one of the things that we do is we evaluate board members based on whether or not they're doing what's asked on this job description. So it's pretty fundamental to what we're doing here. So this is a job description. This is a pretty fundamental tool. I think most organizations have some version of it. Many organizations also have a version of what I call a profile grid, or some people call it a skills matrix, which I don't want to call it because it's much more than skills. So let me talk about what's on this diagram, because there's a lot of good stuff here. First, let me explain it. What the organization does is it identifies 4 different groups of criteria that it wants to use in recruiting people. Those groups are skills and talent, connections, capacity and commitment, and demographics. So you'll see those in the light blue rows that are on this page. And then underneath each of those buckets are a bunch of specific criteria that the organization might be looking for, typically in priority order. Then across the top, we have the initials of our board members. And what we're wanting to do is they're wanting to then evaluate how effectively they're filling these needs and then recruit to fill the gaps between that. Let me show you what that means. First, these four categories are significant, and I want to really emphasize that too often when organizations do this kind of profile grid, their emphasis is on the top one, the skills and talent, and that then becomes a very transactional way of thinking about it. Do you know finance? Good, you can be on our board, because when the moment comes to answer a finance question, you can answer it. Well, I want that, but that's not all I want. And it seems to me that if we think about it only based on skills, we're going to come up pretty short in a lot of ways. The next section is, to me, the most important section of the entire profile grid, which is connections. And how do we ensure that we have relationships and connections with all of the community stakeholder groups that we're talking about? So remember when I was showing that concentric circle and the various interests that come in through those pieces of pie? These are those interests. And so your organization needs to decide which are the ones that we want to have for our group. What would they look like? How would we define them? Fill that section in. Let me go to the bottom first, and then I'm going to back up. The bottom is demographics. This is pretty common. Often we're trying to get diversity by geography and by gender and by age and by ethnicity. I think it's important to be doing all of that kind of gender work. But we don't do that by itself. We're looking to have a diverse board of directors in all of those demographic categories, but that also fulfill the other requirements of the organization. And if we have diversity across the demographics, but we don't have the strengths that we need and the connections that we need throughout the rest of this diagram, then we've missed the point. So I jumped over one, which is this, about 2/3 of the way down, it says capacity and commitment. This is different than most of these profile grids work. And this is the idea that people can give a minimum or they can give more than that. Now, the minimum is okay. That's what the minimum is, not below the minimum. So whatever that minimum is, that's a 1. And if somebody gives a 1, that's good, because you know they're fulfilling the expectations. But if they want to give more than that, if they're willing to commit more than that, that's what the 2 and the 3 allows for. So if we know the level of commitment and interest that those board members have, we can start filling in some detail. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. Let me fill this profile grid in. So what we would do is we'd start identifying the various criteria that each board member has, including their capacity and commitment, and some specifics about their demographics. And if we've done this for one person, we can do it for all of the board and fill in the entire profile grid so we have a clear sense of how our board sort of fills in across the spectrum. Now, I encourage you to think about doing this as a self-reporting exercise. It's a little simpler to manage, and people are mostly pretty honest about it. You have to do a little bit of correction, but mostly it's okay. Once you know this, though, there's a lot we can do with this tool to be intentional about how we recruit to our board. So let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. So the first thing we can do is we can start identifying where we have gaps on our board. So here's unusual. Can't imagine a board that didn't have a lot of people who wanted to do fundraising. Well, in this case, we need to recruit people who are willing to do that work if it's an expectation of the board. Now, if we don't expect our board to raise money, then we shouldn't say it. But if we do expect it of the board, we need to be clear about it and we need to recruit to it. Now, there's other examples of how we're going to want to fill in some gaps as well. Often we'll find that there are places where we're oversubscribed. For example, we may have a lot of public agency representation on our board or public officials who are active on our board. And then we fail to make some of the community connections that may be even more important to our long-term outreach and engagement priorities, like to the faith community, which can be one of the most powerful entrees into various community interests and groups. So if our board is paying attention to this, then we may not recruit one more county planner to our board and recruit a couple more people of faith who may be able to open doors, build relationships, and connect for us. We keep going. When you work farther down here, we're going to identify what the capacities are that people have to give. So this is an important one. Here's an example. We need to have board members who are willing to lean in, as I described, be leaders to help support what we do. While we want to make sure that everybody has at least a 1, we need some 2s and 3s, or else we're not going to have board chairs and committee chairs. So here's an organization that's in trouble because it doesn't and hasn't recruited effectively leaders who have the ability to lean in and really guide the organization. We've got one person on the left who says, I'll be board chair, but she's the only one. I guess it's a he. He's the only one right now, and he's the only one who's willing to be in a leadership role. So I think it's critical that we understand the level of commitment. And while I don't want to diminish the value of a 1, I need some 2s and 3s in that level as well. Let me see if there's some questions on this one. Go ahead, Francis.
So what traits do good board presidents share?
Let me start with that one.
Yeah.
I think the board president's primary role, sometimes we call this person the board chair, is to be the leader of the board. And that person's job is to make sure the board is effective as a board of directors. So the first role is to guide the board, run the meetings. If you don't know how to run a meeting, and that can be sometimes the most intimidating part, there's lots of things that can be done to improve that. And again, Heritage Ohio has some good training materials to support that. But that's not the real big thing. The big thing is making this teamwork. You're the team leader. Connecting to board members. If somebody doesn't show up for a couple of meetings, I think the board chair needs to reach out to them and say, hey, we missed you, where are you? If someone's acting out in a meeting, I think it's the board chair's job to quietly say to them after the meeting, that's not acceptable. We don't want to see that happen. Lots of positive and careful little corrective and enforcing, thanking people for their contributions and their support. So that's a fundamental role of leading the board. The other characteristics of the board chair or board president that are really important is that they're the liaison to the staff lead, the executive director or other staff member, who then communicates and coordinates the board's job versus the staff's job. So if you have paid staff in any way, the board chair and the lead paid staff person, whether it's a manager or executive director, they need to have a really good relationship. So the board chair also needs to be good at communicating within the to the staff and through the executive director. Last thing is that often the board president and chair is asked to speak on behalf of the organization and the community. And this can be a really important role, but I don't think it has to be the board chair's role. Just because a woman is the chair doesn't necessarily mean she's the best person. There might be someone else who could do that. And so if there's someone else and she could do it, maybe it's the chair of our communications committee who would be the right person to do that because she's got more experience in public speaking, and so we can share those functions. So again, I think the more we can take the job of the board chair and logically break it up among people, that would be great. And then the board chair can really lean into her or his role of cultivating and building that relationship. One last thing, I know I'm going on and on here, but I would say that what's the job of the vice president? For too many organizations, it's like nothing. It's like to show up in case the president dies, which is a terrible job to have. I think it makes sense to think about the president and vice president job as a partnership. And maybe you can share those roles. Maybe the vice president is calling half of the board between each meeting and the president is calling the other half of the board between each meeting, just to check in and see how things are going. And in the next meeting, they may switch lists or, somehow dividing the tasks up. But the point is that if we share that job, then the presidency becomes much easier. It's also true if we share that job, then the vice president may be better prepared to assume the job of presidency later on. So there's lots of ways we can make that work. What else?
What are your pros and cons of term limits?
Oh. Okay, I'll do this quick. I'm going to change my slides real quick. I'll go to this one. I'm a big fan of term limits. Let me say it this way. I think term limits are a terrible idea if we don't have these circles. Because what happens is that people who are committed and care about the organization, they go on the board and we have term limits, and when they go off the board, they go away forever. Now, if you think about the incremental way in which we bring people on the board, which is demonstrated by this slide, and maybe even more demonstrated by this slide, and how we bring people into the board by moving them a step at a time, it's also true that we can be asking people to leave the board a step at a time. So think about the possibility that when people leave the board, they don't go away, but those board members may go out to a committee or stay on as an advisor. So in that way, our board circles are made up of people who are moving into the center, but they also work as a way to slowly filter people out from the center. So if we do that, if we use these circles as a way to bring a larger group of people in and retain the talent as we go out, which I think is the best way to go, then I think term limits are essential, because then it revitalizes that pool of talent in the center. It forces us to keep these membranes porous, so we're keeping to move people through them, which is a good thing. And if people have been involved in our organization, they don't have to go away. They can still be active on our committees or be a trustee. And if they step off our board after 2 terms and then they have a term limit requirement, they can come back a year later. My ideal scenario is a 3-year term with 2-term limit, with a 1 year off the board before you start again, and you start again fresh. And the tendency is not to always recycle former board members, but to mix them in along with the new talent that's coming in, so you're constantly creating this fresh talent at the center. But that's a complicated way of saying I think term limits are a good idea, but you have to manage them well, or there's some significant unintended consequences.
So Frank says, you could think of the VP also as the president-elect in formalizing the process of preparing for a leadership role. So what do you say to having a vice president that says, I don't want to take the presidency?
Well, I think it's good to have the vice presidency with the intention that that person is president-elect. So let me play that scenario out a little bit. Let's pretend that we have in our bylaws, the board presidents, the officers are 1-year terms with an expectation of 2-term. So you can be president for 2 years, but after that, not. So I might have a board member who is a president, and I have a president-elect in their first year. If we move them forward 1 year in their second year, I'll do it this way, second year, then we're having the vice president potentially be the president-elect. And that would be the ideal, because then we can put somebody behind them, we can move it forward. If we find out along the way that somebody says, I'd be vice president, but I really don't want to be president-elect, it gives us time to prepare for that. And if that's the exception rather than the rule, then the process of building a leadership pipeline is much better. So I'd like to have the vice president be the president-elect almost always. And once in a while, we're going to find a circumstance where it doesn't work. And that's when we have to keep recruiting until we identify someone who is willing to be president-elect, even though they may be sitting as chair of the board development committee or finance committee or something else in the interim. But I think you have to fill that function. Having ascensions of leadership in your board is a really great strategy. And so I really applaud Frank, I think, who maybe mentioned that.
So can you address the small town fear of not having enough volunteers or enough leaders that are willing to go into these roles if you do assume that term limit?
Yeah, well, I think the term limit issue doesn't really play into this. I think the reality is that, you know, we are, if the way that we keep board members is to force them to stay on the board, there's something wrong with our organization. We need to find a way to fix that. But this model is very much oriented towards small communities where there is a limited pool of leaders, because part of what this model includes is the idea of developing leaders among those who care, and not just relying on the same group of leaders over and over again. And this is a phenomenon that happens in small towns a lot. I think there are more leaders in small town than there are in leadership roles, but we tend to lean on the same people. How do we bring those other people forward? We date them before we get married, and we bring them in a step at a time. So that's one piece of that. But I think the term limit idea that, you know, if we don't keep people on our board, then we'll never find other good people, I think is a really dangerous thing. Let me tell you one brief story that I have about term limits. And then I'm going to start working through some more of the last few elements of our presentation. But this story is an important one. I was on the executive director of an organization, a community-based organization, a fairly small town that had a board of directors, and it had term limits built into it. 3-year terms, 2-term limits, 6 years total. And so I was there I was hired in the 3rd year of this organization's existence. And so 3 years later, we were in the 6th year of our existence, and there was a crisis of faith in the board because several board members were worried because 4 of their very best board members were about ready to term off of the board because they had a term limit, 6 years term. These are 4 former board presidents. All of them had been presidents before, including the founding board president. And they were great fundraisers. And so the board said, maybe we should eliminate that provision in our bylaws that requires us to have term limits. And then the first board president said, no, 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 no. There's a reason we have that provision. It's a good thing. So every single one of those board members moved off of the board out a circle onto a committee. And they stayed active on the committee. And what happened was the organization recruited a man named Hamilton. And Hamilton probably proved to be one of the most effective board members in the entire history of that organization. And he was only brought into that organization because term limits forced the organization to recruit somebody new. If they would have eliminated those term limits, those 3 board members who moved on to committees would have stayed on the board, and Hamilton would have gone someplace else, and we would have lost the contribution of his talent. As it turns out, we kept those board members as committee members, and we got Hamilton. And 2 years later, a couple of those former board members came back on the board, so we didn't lose them at all. So this notion of moving people permeably in and out of these things and really using term limits as a way to really force the best behavior, I really subscribe to that. So let me give you a couple more quick things, and then we're going to bring this to a flying close. So we talked about some of the tools that get used in the board development process, and we focused a lot on this profile grid. I really want to encourage you to think about this profile grid as one of the best ways to understand and analyze how your board can grow and develop. And I think it's important to think about where are we, not paying attention to our geographic diversity or our gender diversity. And now all of a sudden, we're not just recruiting somebody to be on our board, we're recruiting a woman from the north part of our county who is highly committed to what we do and has deep relationships among the faith community. Now we're recruiting a very specific profile, and the odd thing is the more specific the profile is, the easier it is to find that person. We start looking where we know those people are, and we start building the relationships that will make it possible to bring those people into the organization over time. So this grid not only is a matrix that helps do a gap analysis on where your board could grow, but it also could be a long-term roadmap for how you think about developing relationships within your community so that you can have those opportunities to recruit people later on. Okay, so remember, all of these elements still find their way back into these 4 dimensions. And we need to think about how that leadership then is supporting the other dimensions. So let me speak to that very quickly. One of the things that we find is that the leadership development process done with the strategic planning process is particularly powerful because it gives a chance for the board to exercise and understand its job while it's doing its job. It helps clarify lines of authority while that authority is being exercised. And it feeds the board and energizes their knowledge and expertise around the organization at exactly the time when they need that knowledge to make critical decisions around the strategic direction. So we really believe strongly in this notion of doing strategic planning in alignment with your leadership development. The other thing I would say is that we now almost never do a planning process without a connection to an equity plan or some other facet of a cultural component. Because a strategic plan that doesn't have a fundamental equity component built into it really isn't looking at how we're serving the whole of our community. and how we can build all of our strengths as a potential organization, and how we can include all of the voices that care and matter in our community. So that cultural component, we believe, has to be built into every part of this as well. All right, I could go on for a long time, but I'm not gonna. Francis, do you have any other questions, or are there any other questions that are coming up that we can throw up? I think we're getting close to the end. Is that right?
Yes, let's see. I do have a little question that came in. Nope, just a little advertisement for our happy hour in a little bit. But if anyone else has any other questions, then feel free to type those now into the, Mitch Price says, great job. He's our executive director in Van Wert. I've had a lot of private messages from my executive directors, Mark. They always really appreciate this, and they want to know, you know, how as an executive director can I move my board in a direction that they need to go. So I don't know.
This is a great way to finish this. So let's talk about that. So let's say that you're an executive director and you think that there are a couple of really good ideas in this conversation that we've just had that you could use within your organization. Let's pretend, just for fun, that there are 10 good ideas that came up here. My first piece of advice is don't try to do 10 things. Don't ever. Pick 2 or 3 of the most important first steps and start there. If you're an executive director, I strongly encourage you to identify and cultivate a champion on your board of directors, somebody that you can talk to and help learn with and learn from, who can be the voice for that priority, because the voices for what needs to happen with the board should come from the board. And while I do think it's helpful for an executive director to be a positive, quiet whisperer in the ears of leaders of the board, the leadership has to come from the board of directors. If you're a board member and you think these ideas are good and you go back and start waving your arms around about all the things you need to do, they'll consider you potentially a lunatic, and they may be right. But if you go back with a couple of ideas, and if you cultivate other champions among your peers on the board, and identify other board members who you think would resonate with these ideas, and now we've got 2 or 3 board members that are all saying, you know what, we should think about our board development committee differently, or maybe we could think about having a different process of recruiting people initially into our organization, or whatever it is. Now you've got a more of a chorus instead of a lone voice trying to bring those ideas forward. So that's one of the things that I would say.
Great. I'm seeing, if you're seeing the chat too, Mark, everyone's really thrilled with the training as usual. I feel like this always energizes our boards and our executive directors. Thanks.
So
Thanks.
here's a question that I saw. Let me finish with this, and then I think I'm going to sign off.
Great.
Top 3 ideas for and sources for board training. That's a great question. So, source, Heritage Ohio. They got lots of good information and people are willing to help. They have lots of presentations and materials that people like me have been doing through this week and the next weeks. There's so much good material that you can draw on, especially now that we've got virtual and recordings. These are things that you can show again. You could show this presentation to your board potentially. So draw on these resources. So that's one thing I would say. But there's a world of resources. There's a great source out there called Board Source, which has a deep wealth of training materials and handouts and examples that I strongly encourage. If you really want to get some help, go there. But here's the one that I want you to think about mostly. Think about the leadership and knowledge that's already inherent within your own organization. Who on your board has the most board experience and is effective at humbly and effectively sharing her knowledge? Who on the staff knows the most about some of your downtown preservation priorities and can help the board engage in those conversations and teach the board how to do that job? So how about relying on our board members, on our volunteers, and on our staff members who have deep knowledge to be among that pool of talent that we lean on to do the training? And what we do is we also strengthen the culture and the relationships within the organization at the same time. So I think I'm going to be done. There may be more questions and there may be some more ideas. If there are, I would encourage you, if there's questions, Francis, I'd be glad to continue to answer those questions offline. So you're welcome to forward those to me if they come.
Great.
Folks, I encourage you to keep leaning into this. I just want to sing my praises for Heritage Ohio, for Francis and Joyce and all the folks there that are doing such a great job of helping groups throughout your state come together and work, especially in these times where it's so important. So I'm glad you're maintaining community as we work in our communities, and you're maintaining this commitment to serve our community. And since people like me live vicariously through you, I thank you very much for your service and your great work.
Thanks so much, Mark. For those of you who were here during the live session, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to join us for our next presentation, which is Total Impact Rebuilding the Community with Seth Baker, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And we also hope that you'll join us this evening at 5 o'clock with our Main Street Networking Happy Hour. We have a special guest, Patrice Fry. She's the president of the National Main Street Center. So come and join us and bring your questions for Patrice. So that starts at 5 o'clock. I've got a nice little bottle of bourbon waiting for my 5 o'clock. So pour your little beverage and join us at 5 o'clock.
And one more thing I'd like to do, if you don't mind. I'd just like to post an advertisement for my colleague, Leland Brown, who's going to be doing a workshop tomorrow about engagement and inclusion and the whole idea of how we think differently about engaging the community. It's going to strongly reinforce a lot of the things that I talked about today, but it's going to go much deeper and even better into that topic. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I think you're going to get a lot of benefit out of Leland's session. So I hope to see you there.
Yes, that's not tomorrow, that's on Thursday.
Thursday, thank you. Sorry, I lost my head. Thursday, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all the time, Mark. Thanks for being here, everyone. Bye.